Welcome to History Lost in Time, from one enthusiast to others. And welcome to the first proper episode on this channel. We will start with a naval topic, and today's episode will be the start of a series that will discuss the history of the German Navy. The first question to answer is, when does a German Navy actually start? Germany as a nation-state didn't exist before 1871, and should you now think of the Holy Roman Empire, you are in for a disappointment that never had a navy. However, following the revolution of 1848, there was a Reich Navy for a couple of years, so I will start there. The focus will be on ship classes first. Strategy and politics can be discussed later, if that's what interests you. Today's podcast is about the steam sail hybrids that served in the Prussian and German Navy. And of course, the first episode already has excess length. So I initially wanted to split the episode. But then I noticed that 3 of the first 4 episodes have excess length. So who cares? Why this topic today? Why this topic and why Navy at all? Well, first of all, because it interests me. And second of all, during the 19th century, a very interesting time of change started for the navies of the world. The century-old standard of wooden sail ships with muzzle-loader cannons on the broadside began to be completely replaced due to several technical revolutions that happened at the same time. When it comes to naval technology, 1850 to 1950 is the most interesting time you can find. Political background and commentary. I have no agenda here. It's not about militarism or anti-militarism, glorification or condemnation of the German Navy. I just want to discuss a topic that I am personally interested in. If you want to take anything from this, then please these 2 points. 1. Naval development is a long-term issue. Building ships is expensive and takes time. That has never changed. It was valid back then and still is. The Navy should always be capable to fight a war. You cannot rely on your arms industry to quickly build new ships once war has started. Success at sea will depend on the equipment you have at the beginning of the war. 2. Revolutions in military technology can make equipment obsolete very quickly. Those who react too late or not at all will suffer and pay a bitter price later. The sources. As this is a non-controversial topic deep in the past, there is no problem with using Wikipedia as a source. However, you basically are limited to numbers and clinical facts there, nothing that paints a living picture of the ships. Therefore, I went through my private library and I will use the following books as my main sources. Erich Raeder, Mein Leben bis zum Flottenabkommen mit England 1935. Translation, My Life Until the Fleet Agreement with England in 1935. Published by Verlag Fritz Schlichtenmeier, Tübingen, 1956. Raeder, Commander-in-Chief of the German Navy in World War II, started his career on steam sail hybrids. Alfred von Tirpitz, Erinnerungen, gekürzte Volksausgabe. Translation, Memories, Shortened Public Edition, published by Verlag KF Köhler, Leipzig, 1919. Tirpitz, who contributed a lot to the creation of the German High Seas Fleet, mostly talks about politics in his memoirs, however one can still use his book as a source. Admiral Scheer, Vom Segelschiff zum U-Boot. Translation, From the Sailship to the Submarine, published by Verlag Quelle und Meyer, Leipzig, New Edition, 1936. Scheer was head of the fleet during the Battle of Jutland. In his book he describes his career in great detail, and the first 100 pages exclusively deal with his early career aboard steam sail hybrids. It's a fascinating book, definitely worth reading. Ulrich Israel, Jürgen Gebauer, Kriegsschiffe im 19. Jahrhundert. Translation, Warships in the 19th Century. Published by Verlag Gondrom, Bindlach, 1989, licensed version of the military publisher of the German Democratic Republic, Communist East Germany. Israel and Gebauer give a good overview about the technical revolutions of the time and mostly limit their socialist commentary. Günter Kroschel, August Ludwig Evers, Die deutsche Flotte 1848 bis 1945. Translation: The German Fleet 1848 to 1945. Published by Verlag Lose Eising, Wilhelmshaven 1962, third improved edition 1964. Kroschel and Evers mostly deliver raw data and pictures about the ships, which makes it a good source to check Wikipedia for accuracy. Hans-Jürgen Hansen, Die Schiffe der deutschen Flotten 1848 bis 1945. Translation: The Ships of the German Fleets 1848 to 1945. Published by Verlag Bechtermünz. Licensed version for the Weltbild Verlag, Augsburg 1998. Hansen combines the contents of Israel Gebauer and Kroschel Evers, completing my sources. Ocean-going vessels from the 15th to 19th century basically looked like this. Hull and superstructure made of wood, propulsion from sails, weapons consist of manually operated muzzle-loading cannons, and no electricity, no engines, no electronics. Obviously, there were developments between the 15th and 19th century, however, these basics didn't change. During the course of the 19th century, these basics all changed. The ships of the year 1900 had not much in common with those of the year 1800. Wood had been replaced by iron and steel, and the ships had armor made from these materials as well. The muzzle-loading cannons had been replaced by modern guns that were no longer in the broadside but in modern turrets. The combat distances were much greater, and new ammunition types like grenades replaced non-explosive iron ammunition. Torpedoes, machine cannons, and devices to measure distances found their place on modern warships. The propulsion system sail was first complemented by steam engines and then finally replaced by them. Ships were designed as paddle steamers or using ships' propellers, and in the early 20th century, turbines were first installed on ships. The engines were first powered by coal, later by oil. Generators to create electric power were finally installed on board of modern warships. In the 20th century, radios, echolocation and acoustic systems and radar was installed as well. Aircraft and new ship types like torpedo boats, destroyers and submarines created new challenges. Things like turbines, radar and aircraft obviously have no place in the 19th century. However, consider this. If warships had been in service for as long as they are in service today, these ships would have faced all of that. The technical revolutions of the time shortened the potential service life of warships considerably. Nations were forced to run intense naval arms programs. On page 13, Israel and Gebauer have the following to say. The general introduction of the steam engine as the main propulsion system by using propellers or paddles, the usage of iron and later steel for hulls and armor, and a massive jump regarding the quality of the ship's artillery meant that many ships that were built between 1854 and 1889 and suffered from long building times did no longer meet the requirements once they were finished. They were obsolete before they were launched. That process meant that for a while the nation's navies consisted of wooden sail ships and armored steamships with hulls made from wood, iron, or a combination of that. For a while the old and the new coexisted. Germany, or rather the German states, had never been huge naval nations. Obviously there was a strong maritime tradition at the coast, and within certain city alliances like the Hanse. However, this was mostly about merchant shipping, not maritime warfare. Here, nations like England, Spain, and Portugal have a much stronger tradition. Additionally, the small German coastal states didn't have the resources to create and operate large navies, and the only state that had these resources, Prussia, focused with good reason on the army. Against its main rivals in Europe, Russia, France, and Austria, a navy was of little use. That meant that after the Congress of Vienna in 1815, the only German state to have a navy at all was Prussia, and its navy was at best third rate. There were pioneers like Prince Adalbert of Prussia who tried to change that. They started a lengthy modernization process, but this only gained traction by the time Emperor Wilhelm II and Admiral von Tirpitz took charge of it. Until then, the German fleet remained small and fairly insignificant. The Reich fleet that was founded in 1848 did rather badly in the war against Denmark from 48 to 51. The naval enthusiasm that had swept through the German public in 1848 quickly faded again. However, the increase in ocean-going trade, the need for national recognition, and the technical developments in other nations, for example the ocean-going ironclad Gloire of France in 1859 and the HMS Warrior of Great Britain in 1860, forced Prussia to at least take some modest steps regarding naval development. However, during the unification wars of 1864, 66 and 70-71, the navy remained insignificant and didn't do very well. After the formation of the German Empire in 1871, a naval program was set up to improve the situation. According to that program, a mix of ironclads, gunboats and torpedo boats were supposed to protect the coastlines, while a fleet of cruisers that consisted of steam sail hybrids was supposed to take over ocean-going tasks. And today we'll discuss these steam sail hybrids. First, a few words regarding the terminology. I use the term steam sail hybrid intentionally. There are tons of different names and classifications regarding these ships, not counting all the subclasses. Israel and Gebauer have the following to say about this on page 35. The differentiation and classification of warships became a lot more complicated. The differences between frigates and corvettes, both rigid ships, became fuzzy. Ships were basically randomly called either a frigate or a corvette without any objective classification factors. A ship that was a frigate in one fleet was a corvette in another. I will therefore only use the terms frigate and corvette, not the subclasses, but I will mostly stick to steam sail hybrid. In the end, all these ships would end up as cruisers, with a few steps in between, but I think the terms don't really matter, as long as we all know what we are talking about. I am aware that there are people out there who can discuss until the end of time about such things, like is this ship a battleship or a battle cruiser? However, these discussions are pointless, because, as Gebauer and Israel have said, there are no objective universally agreed upon criteria that determine what a ship should be called. So, the steam sail hybrids were supposed to perform ocean-going duties. In the era of imperialism and colonialism, this was an important job. However, as Germany didn't have colonies before the 1880s, at first this basically meant to protect overseas trade, patrolling between trade outposts and showing the flag. The unarmored steel sail hybrids were used for that because armor was irrelevant for this job, and the combination of low weight and the steam sail hybrid propulsion meant that they were fast and had a long range. However, as we will see, the technical revolutions of the time forced the ships into secondary roles, like training faster and faster, and the life cycles became shorter and shorter. Most of them were decommissioned by the year 1900 or just survived as hulks or floating living quarters. Sails were the preferred method of propulsion. Hansen writes the following on page 65. The fully rigged ship that had a complementary steam engine and a propeller was very well suited as a cruiser for ocean-going duties. They were used in that capacity while the heavy armored ships became part of the home fleet. For 2/3 of the way, they used the sails as a means of propulsion, the steam engines only for 1/3. And a bit further down he writes, during these missions, the ships performed a wide range of tasks: scientific exploration regarding oceanography, ethnography, geography, and a lot of surveying, training missions for junior officers and cadets, defending German trade interests, and performing small political enterprises, especially when it was necessary to show the flag for economic or diplomatic pressure. Showing the flag included small combat missions and naval landings, as Admiral Scheer describes in great detail in his memoirs. So the crews of the ships weren't just sailors, they also served as marines. Israel and Gebauer are a bit more critical than Hansen regarding the usage of these ships. On page 9 they write, however, already at peace times naval power was an effective tool to put pressure on other nations. Their presence alone meant that diplomacy now had fists of steel. Now let's take a look at the ship classes and their technology. In order to understand what the steam sail hybrids were up against, we will first look at the SMS Niobe. This was a pure-blooded sail ship that served as a training ship in the Prussian and later the German Navy from 1862 to 1890. It started out as a British ship of the Diamond-class, but it was never commissioned and was sold to Prussia after spending 13 years in reserve. It was a small ship with a length of only 43 meters and a width of 13 meters. Its top speed with its sails was 14 knots. It was armed with 16 68-pounders and 4 30-pounder cannons, which were later replaced by modern 15 and 12-centimeter guns. In his memoirs, Admiral Scheer is clearly a fan of this ship. On page 4 he says, "Our Niobe was an excellent ship. Construction and stability seemed to make capsizing impossible. She was also very maneuverable." The first steam sail hybrids were the ships of the Arcona-class, SMS Arcona, Gazelle, Vineta, Hertha, and Elizabeth. They were considered frigates and built in Danzig. They were built between 1854 and 69, so over a span of 15 years. That means that there were some differences between the oldest and youngest ships of this class. The ships had a length of 72 to 79 meters and a width of 13 meters, so they were much larger than the Niobe. They displaced about 2,500 tons and had a crew of 380. Their steam engines produced between 1,320 and 2,440 horsepower and accelerated the ship to a top speed of about 12 knots. Their ranges were between 2,100 and 3,500 kilometers, or 1,300 to 2,175 miles. Initially, the Arcona ships were also equipped with 68 and 36 pounders, but were later also converted to 15-centimeter guns. The Arcona-class was used until the 1880s and then scrapped until 1904. So they served about 20 to 30 years within the fleet, similar to the Niobe. According to Israel and Gebauer, the Arcona ships were fairly maneuverable while using the sails. However, they were considered to be mediocre ships with some weaknesses. That's at least what they say on pages 74 and 75. Admiral Scheer served on one of these ships, the SMS Hertha, during a long voyage in 1880. On page 14 of his book he says, "She was one of the oldest ships of the Prussian Navy and looked very much like the old-school sail frigates, with the exception of the steam engine. It produced 1,500 horsepower and had been built in England by the John Penn and Son Company. The double-leaf propeller could be moved into a tunnel-like construction at the back of the ship, which allowed the ship to sail without being hindered by the propeller. Additionally, the funnel could be lowered in order to make room for the main sail. When we stayed in a harbor, that was standard procedure, as it was considered to make the ship look better." Scheer's description regarding the optics of the ship can be applied to all ships I mention in this episode. Without the funnel, all these ships looked like ordinary sail ships. How was it like to serve aboard these ships? Hansen, Admiral Scheer, and Admiral Räder have something to say about that. On page 72, Hansen describes the general life aboard these ships. Serving aboard these ships was strictly controlled by the so-called routine, which applied to all ships and which determined to the minute what would be done, when, and by who. The tradition of the routine survived to some degree even into the post-World War II age, and not just in the German Navy. When the ship was in harbor, this meant the following: getting up at 0500, cleaning up the hammocks until 0505, washing and dressing until 0540, after that cleaning up, breakfast at 7, flag parade at 8, then cleaning and training duties, lunch at 12, then more duties, dinner at 1800, then some spare time, however jobs like peeling potatoes still had to be done during that time, 2100, silence. When the ship was at sea, there were no such things as waking up, flag parade, or silence aboard, since they were rotating 4-hour shifts. In their spare time, the sailors sang or played musical instruments. Remember, back then, there were no entertainment electronics. Admiral Scheer stressed that the traditional training with the sails was still vital. On page 3 he explains, "Even though the steam engine had already been introduced into the fleet, basic training of naval officers still consisted of the handling of the sails and the rigging. Ocean-going cruisers at the time were still fully rigged, just like the ironclads. And as long as the sails were used as a means of propulsion, knowledge regarding their handling was vital. It was considered to be an advantage not to depend on coal. Speed was irrelevant, as sailors of the time were used to deal with the changing conditions of wind and weather. Admiral Raeder confirms that, even in the 1890s, when he trained on one of the last steam sail hybrids, this hadn't changed much. On page 22 he writes, "Our duties mostly consisted of sailing and rigging duties, artillery service with the old 15-centimeter guns, and theoretical training in navigation, seamanship, mathematics, English, and French. During the summer we sailed within the Baltic Sea, and during the winter we were on a large voyage to the West Indies. Following a couple of incidents, like losing our propeller in the North Sea and the breaking of our jib boom in the Bay of Biscay, which forced us to make a stop at Wilhelmshaven and later at Lissabon, we sailed using the Passat winds via Madeira to St. Thomas, Jamaica, and Havana. We returned via San Domingo, the Bermudas, Plymouth, and around Skagen to Kiel. There our ship was inspected by Admiral Knorr. Us cadets had to take our tests in theory and practice." While the Arconas were considered frigates, the ships of the Nymphe-class were considered to be corvettes. They were built at Danzig between 1862 and 67. They were a lot smaller than the Arconas. Their length was 65 meters, their width 10 meters. They only displaced 1,200 tons and had a crew of 190. Their steam engines only produced 790 horsepower, but the ship still made 12 knots and had a range of 2,320 kilometers or 1,440 miles. Their light armament consisted of 36 and 12-pounders, which was later converted to 12-centimeter guns. The SMS Nymphe served in the fleet until 1885, was then used as a hulk and scrapped in 1891. The SMS Medusa was already decommissioned in 1880 and also served as a hulk until 1891. She was scrapped that same year. So the Nymphe-class ships served for about 20 years. By the way, if you don't know, hulk has nothing to do with a green superhero. It just means that a ship is without a propulsion system and used for various duties in a harbor, like floating barracks, depot, or something else. In 1864, Prussia bought 2 corvettes in France that were supposed to strengthen the Prussian fleet during the war with Denmark. The corvettes were initially built for the Confederate States of America, however Emperor Napoleon III had stopped the export with his veto. The ships came too late to participate in the war with Denmark, however they joined the Arconas and the Nymphen as ocean-going ships. These ships formed the Augusta-class, SMS Augusta and SMS Victoria. They were 81 meters long and 11 meters wide. Their displacement is a bit difficult to determine. Wikipedia claims 2,272 tons. Kroschel-Evers claim 1,300 to 1,400 tons. However, all sources agree that their steam engines produced 1,300 horsepower and that the ships had a top speed of 13.5 knots and a range of 4,600 kilometers or 2,850 miles. The crew consisted of 230 people. The ships were lightly armed with 24 and 12-pounders, which was later converted to 15, 12 and 8-centimeter guns, as well as 37mm revolver cannons. In 1885, SMS Augusta sank after 20 years of service in the Gulf of Aden. The entire crew died. SMS Victoria served for 15 years and was decommissioned in 1881. She was used as a harbor ship until 1890 and then scrapped. Following the victory over Austria in 1866, Prussia and the northern German states formed the North German Confederacy. The next class of steam sail hybrids were built under that flag in Danzig. The ships of the Ariadne-class, SMS Ariadne, Luise and Freya, were built between 1868 and 76. The Freya was larger than her 2 sisters. Ariadne and Luise had a length of 68 meters, Freya was 85 meters long. All 3 had a width of 11 meters. Ariadne and Luise displaced 2,072 tons, Freya 2,400 tons. The first 2 had a steam engine producing 2,260 horsepower, Freya's produced 2,800 horsepower. Freya reached a top speed of 15.2 knots, Ariadne and Louise were limited to 14.1 knots. However, the major difference was range, since the Freya had much larger coal bunkers. While her sisters had a range of 2,480 kilometers, or 1,540 miles, Freya could do 4,600 kilometers, or 2,850 miles. The Ariadnes had a mix of 15 and 12 cm guns, later upgraded to 17 cm guns. This is the first class of steam sail hybrids that was actually faster using the steam engines than the pure-blood sail ship SMS Niobe. However, we also see the trend that the life cycle became shorter and shorter. The Ariadne was decommissioned in 1890 after barely serving 20 years with the fleet. She was scrapped already in 1891. Louise only served until 81 and was then used as a training ship. She became a hulk in 92, and in 96 she became a torpedo test ship before she was finally scrapped. Freya only served with the fleet until 81. She then served as a training ship until 84. She was modernized until 87, but already decommissioned in 88. She was finally scrapped in 96. We can see the following pattern emerge. The steam sail hybrids are decommissioned in the 1880s and 1890s and relegated to secondary roles and then scrapped during the 1890s. While new ships were better than their predecessors, they were basically decommissioned alongside them. This goes on with the ships of the Leipzig-class. These were built from 1875 to 77 in Stettin. SMS Leipzig and SMS Prinz Adalbert were identical and with a length of 87.5 meters and a width of 14 meters, the largest ships in this episode. They displaced about 4,600 tons and had crews of 425. Their steam engines produced 6,050 horsepower, which gave them a top speed of 15.8 knots and a range of 4,320 kilometers, or 2,680 miles. Initially, they were armed with 12 17 cm guns, but that was increased with the addition of 4 37mm revolver cannons and 4 35 cm torpedo tubes. According to Israel and Gebauer, these ships were maneuverable, but overall only mediocre, especially when the coal bunkers were completely full. That's at least what they say on page 72. Leipzig was modernized in 85 and served with the fleet until 95, so basically for 20 years. After that she was used as a floating barracks and a training hulk. She sank in 1919, unrelated to World War I, was raised in 1921 and then scrapped. That means she served longer as a hulk than as a fleet ship. SMS Prinz Adalbert only served for 10 years with the fleet. In 85 she was relegated to training duties and in 88 transformed into a floating barracks. In 1907 she was finally scrapped. At the same time, the ships of the Bismarck-class were built. Please don't confuse them with the Kriegsmarine battleships from World War II. SMS Bismarck, Blücher, Stosch, Moltke, Gneisenau and Stein were built in Kiel, Stettin and Danzig between 1875 and 1880. They were also fairly large, with a length of 82 meters and a width of 13.7 meters. They displaced 3,000 to 3,400 tons and had a crew of 404. Their steam engines produced between 2,300 and 3,000 horsepower, which allowed them top speeds of 12.5 to 13.9 knots and ranges up to 4,400 kilometers or 2,730 miles. They were armed with 10 to 16 15 cm guns, 2 8.8 cm guns and 6 37mm cannons. Blücher and Bismarck were later also equipped with 2 or 4 35 cm torpedo tubes. Israel and Gebauer write on page 76 that the Bismarck ships were basically good ships that suffered from maneuverability problems. However, when it comes to service life, we can see the same wall in the 1880s and 90s that forced all other steam sail hybrids out of service. Bismarck served until